Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is going to be the second episode of our kind of JFK arc. The idea is that this is going to be dealing with a couple of the different overarching patterns, issues, topics that kind of flow through that beginning period of the 1960s. And today we're going to talk about the space race. I am joined here by Eric Rush, who most of you have heard before. So Eric, do you want to introduce yourself for a second?
Yeah, Chris, it's good to be here again. And this is a subject that's a little different from the ones I've talked about before on A Fork in Time, but it's one that I'm very excited about. I have been I will call it a space enthusiast. I have no particular expertise in aeronautical engineering or space flight or things like that. I'm obviously not an engineer, but I am very interested in the space program and the history of space travel, and that's kind of where we're heading today, right?
It is. I have to say we got very lucky. If you follow both podcasts, kind of off podcast, I'd been discussing this with Eric yesterday when we were recording the Hall of Mirrors episode, and
Right.
I had kind of a vague idea, but I'm really happy. I'm really impressed that Eric, has really run with this, and I think we got a really good episode coming. So, do you want to go ahead and set it up for us a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the 1960s and the space race Cold War context, but one of the places we're going to start out is with one particular personality. There's one personality that is actually quite important to the early parts of the U.S. space program, and that is Wernher von Braun. He was a German and later German American aerospace engineer who was responsible for the V2 rockets in World War II. He was one of the leaders of that project, but he also had a lot of roles in the U.S. space program that we'll discuss later in the podcast. One of the things that's very interesting about von Braun is that only a couple of months before he surrendered to U.S. forces in Austria, actually, he was in a car accident, a pretty bad one, in March of 1945, where he was on official business. He was significantly injured and actually broke his arm quite badly. And so if anybody wants to look in Wikipedia at the entry for him, you can see the picture of him in May of 1945. He still has a pretty large cast on his left arm. So
I've actually looked that up, and I'm pretty sure we're gonna make that one the
is that going to be the graphic for the episode?
I really think that needs to be it. Yeah,
I think that's fine. But what Chris and I were wanting to set up is what would happen if he didn't break his arm? What if he broke his neck or in some other way was killed in this car accident in March of 1945? And so there is no Wernher von Braun to bring to the United States after the war. So that's the setup, and that's where we're going to go through the early part of the Cold War and the space race after this.
Alexis and Don taking just a quick break from the podcast here. Normally this is where we would have an ad or a mention. I think that's the inside term that we're supposed to, brand mention is what they're called, at least on the website when we're loading an episode. But today I'm just going to directly appeal for one of the other ways that you can help the podcast, where you may not get as much directly back in return as we do from the others, but still something that's important. So Lex, what is Patreon?
So Patreon is a platform where actually you can go and support the podcast that you love, including A Fork in Time.
Yeah, and it's not just podcast there. Patreon is probably the number one platform for artists and folks who have various things to be supported on. So podcasts frequently are there, but it can be YouTube channels, it can be the other things that are there. But basically, it's your opportunity to become a subscriber or a patron, hence Patreon, for the show. So here at A Fork in Time, we do have a few patrons, and we appreciate them. It doesn't cost a tremendous amount of money to put on a podcast, but it does cost money. And so over time, one of the ways that you can help us defray the cost of the podcast, we've been able to use some of the money to upgrade the equipment that we use. Hopefully you notice that from time to time, is actually by supporting us on Patreon. So Alexis, how does someone find how to support us on Patreon?
Just go to the link in the show notes. You'll see a Patreon link and click on that and you'll get all set up.
Yeah, the other place you can go is actually to our website, which is www.aforkintimepodcast.com. There's a Patreon link there, as well as other non-monetary ways that you can support the show. Alexis and I have said this a number of times. We did not start a podcast to retire on. It's not that lucrative, particularly not a niche podcast about alternate history. But still, there are costs in doing that. So if you can help us out either through financial or non-financial means, we certainly would appreciate it. And we appreciate, again, the fact that we have built a global audience of what we think of as being our little community. And so we invite you to be a part of that. Anything else you want to say about that, Lex?
Just thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
All right, welcome back to A Fork in Time. And so today's, the space race episode, talking about what happens, that pattern we've talked about before of what happens if you remove one of those people. How much is it a person versus forces and patterns and institutions? To get there, though, do you want to go ahead and fill us in more on what did happen?
Absolutely. And so I'd be happy to tell you what happened. And before I tell you what happened with von Braun specifically, I think a little background on just what the immediate post-war and kind of as the war was concluding, what that looked like. There were a lot of German scientists that were present in Germany, and there was a quite a race between the different allies, particularly the Western allies versus the Soviet Union, to try to claim some of these scientists. And a lot of these scientists were in various, we'll call them strategic industries of various sorts, and there was great interest in acquiring these to use in the post-war period. A lot of these were things like missile technology, other weapons technology, petrochemicals, other industries like this that were important. And so the project that was endorsed in the United States was one that came to be known as Operation Paperclip. And what this was looking to do is bring a number of German scientists and engineers to the United States. It ended up being, as memory served, about 1,600 people that were brought over to the U.S. Between the years of 1945 and as late as 1959, and this was approved by President Truman in 1945 to bring these folks over. And which name was near the top of the list for Operation Paperclip? Wernher von Braun was at the top of that list. Again, I'd mentioned to you that he was a key designer and developer of the German V2 rockets. The United States knew that we didn't have quite the rocket technology either the Soviet Union, quite frankly, or the Germans had. And so we knew we wanted to have access to the technology, and we wanted to have access to the expertise. This was all being done at the island of Peenemünde during World War II, and this was in the Soviet occupation zone, as I recall. So we didn't get access necessarily to the facilities that the Soviet Union did, but we did get access to some of the expertise. So in our timeline, von Braun was secretly moved to the United States, and he's contributed pretty significantly to both the U.S. ballistic missile programs and subsequently to the U.S. space program. Interestingly enough, he surrendered to a U.S. soldier, just a random U.S. soldier that happened to be in Austria a few days before VE Day in 1945. Fortunately for, I guess I would say for the timeline and just in terms of the success of the space program, we understood the value of him as a target, and he was detained for interrogation. Now, what I think that there's some things that need to be said about von Braun, we are not going to be lionizing him today. We are going to be acknowledging him for his contributions, for his inventions and things like that. And, A Fork in Time is not really an overt political podcast, and we're going to keep it that way. It's a little bit different than Room Where It Happened, but it should be stated that von Braun was a member of the Nazi Party and was an officer in the SS. And the operation at Peenemünde utilized slave labor under conditions that we are all too familiar with from the history books in World War II. And so there is blood on his hands, either by commission or by collusion, for this human suffering. So even though the reputation was mostly rehabilitated in the US over the 1960s, as he started to become more of a public figure, and as a result of his successes in the space program. But what I will say is Nazis do not get to forget that they are Nazis, and we do not forget that they are Nazis. So that's my politics for the day, that we have to understand who some of these people are and who some of these people were before we proceed further. And so if we look at what von Braun did in the US after he moved here, so he originally worked for the Army. And one of the things that was very interesting about some of the early technological development that led to the space race is this was mostly done within individual armed services branches. And so there was an Army branch, there was Air Force programs, there were naval programs, and von Braun worked mostly initially for the Army, and we know him best at working in the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. He was there for about 20 years, and in that capacity, he led to what is known as the Redstone rocket. And this was I think we would probably call it a short-range ballistic missile, Chris. That is a gap in my knowledge. I don't know exactly what the range estimates would be on that, but I think we would consider it to be a short-range missile.
Today it would be, but it keeping in mind these were very much built off of the initial V2s. This is as long range as we had back then.
True, that's a good point.
Picture it kind of a regional reach. I'm thinking a little bit about, for those of us of at least I would say my or our generation that remember the Scuds of the first Gulf War. Picture that reach.
Yep. Absolutely. No, that actually makes a lot of sense to put that in context that way. But so the Redstone rocket was an early attempt at ballistic missiles, and as Chris said, it definitely one that's more of regional. Certainly not something that was global in nature. But what we eventually started doing, and this is true through a lot of the space program, actually, is that a lot of the rockets that were used to propel the manned space program were actually in many ways retrofitted or modified missiles that were used for nuclear weapons. And so there is a very clear line of succession from the Redstone rocket to what are known as the Jupiter A and Jupiter C. And then the Jupiter C was further modified to a rocket type called the Juno 1. And the Juno 1 was the rocket that launched the first US satellite. This is Explorer 1 in 1958. This was our response to Sputnik. And that was a different rocket. And then the first two Mercury missions were actually a modified Jupiter C. They called it Mercury Redstone, but it was a modified Jupiter C. And this includes both the Freedom 7. So the Freedom 7 was Alan Shepard. That was the first American in space. And then the second one was Liberty Bell 7. That was Gus Grissom. So
and one thing I do find interesting to think about is talking about these two parallel paths that are going on. One is nuclear weapons, one is rocket technology.
Absolutely.
And in my research for this, I did find something really interesting. The United States had a rocket pioneer by the name of Robert Goddard, who had done some early research, and the Dorenberg, the military head of the Nazi weapons project, very explicitly told von Braun and the other scientists working on their ballistic missile program that they were in a race with the United States.
Right.
That they, it just so happens that Goddard had stopped publishing. he had trouble finding funding during the Depression and such, but they read that as, oh, he started working for the military and all it got classified now. For those of you familiar with the Manhattan Project, doesn't that sound a little bit familiar? That the United States is saying to its scientists, hey, we need to rush to get this done because we're racing Germany. The other thing that I do want to throw out there, you did mention this a little bit, but and you took us right up to 57, which I think is a really important year.
Yeah.
Before that, the United States did have von Braun working for the United States Army.
Right.
You also, very soon after he gets here, have the development of something called the United States Air Force.
Right.
Then you also have the United States Navy, which is doing rocket technology research. This is actually what Goddard was doing on something called JATO, Jet Assisted Takeoff, which is literally strapping rockets to planes to make them able to take off from carriers easier.
Right.
And just thinking about the United States rocket program pre-57, it does remind me a little bit of whatever information came out about the German atomic research, where everybody is doing their own thing and they're not talking to each other. I mean, at one point, you literally had the post office doing research on reactors. So the two things just popped through my mind. And the other thing was thinking about what these missiles, what these rockets could actually carry. This is another interesting thing of keeping in mind that the first weapons used by the United States, we had to modify B-29s. The I'm going to say off the shelf B-29 could not carry a nuclear weapon.
Right.
So you have these two development paths. People have this idea of merging them, but you need to have bigger, more powerful rockets plus smaller, more efficient weapons so you can actually lift them.
That's true, and that took us a while to do. There was a period of years after we had nuclear weapons that they were really only available to be deployed by bomber. And you could easily see, and we're kind of getting in a little bit into the what if part of this, but you could easily see a scenario where we don't have as robust of a ballistic missile program, where the bomber era is a longer era. I think you could very easily imagine that. So I took us up to 1957. So there are two main reasons why I took us up to 1957. And the reason one is Sputnik. And so this is the notion. Now we are behind in the space race. And so we are, at least that is the sentiment, that we are behind in the space race. And there is one person that was not necessarily all that concerned about space exploration, about the space program, but was very concerned about the politics of perception of being behind, and that was President Dwight Eisenhower. He was not necessarily a huge proponent of the space program, but he also understood that we couldn't be perceived as weak and we couldn't be perceived as behind the Soviet Union.
And the one you did mention earlier, that the Soviets got a little lucky.
They did.
The entire program had been, the site of the development had been in their zone. And from everything I understand about the science of it, they were very easily able to extend the kind of hardware and the equipment that they captured and the technical documents they captured there. And that was a really big part of their ability to jump out to that quick lead. Absolutely.
And they also had their own kind of leader of their rocket program, and that was Sergei Korolev, who had been working with liquid propellant rockets for a couple of decades before all this happened. And so then he had significant expertise in and of himself. And then we have all these German personnel and material that were brought in from Peenemünde, and Soviets have a nice little head start there.
And I think one of the other things is Korolev was in charge of a design bureau.
He was.
And all of the material that they did capture was fed into his single program.
Yep.
Kind of like, again, thinking about the other side of this huge great ability coin, when the United States developed the Manhattan Project, just want to say this, it wasn't just the United States, it was also Canada and Great Britain decided to centralize all of their work. So this idea of you get success when you put everything into one thing, when you just kind of let, I don't know the right way to say this, but bureaucratic, everybody having their own finger in the pot, your efforts kind of get dispersed, like the United States efforts were pre-Eisenhower, having this, we have to get ourselves together and have NASA have a single effort.
Right. And well, there's the critical acronym here is in 1958, we realize in some ways the error of having these disparate programs. And we do create an agency that is specifically for space administration. And so NASA was created in response to this. And that was I think unquestionably a critical development in the US space program. I think there are many reasons to think that the absence or the presence of one single person may not be the deciding factor in a space program, but the inability to pull things together to form a cohesive effort certainly would have been. And so that was one of the things that occurred that was extremely important was the establishment of NASA in 1958. And so NASA was created in 1958, and almost immediately it sought to embark on the idea of manned space travel. And so this is where we come up with Project Mercury. But that takes a while to come to fruition, but uses, again, as I mentioned before, the first two Mercury missions used rocket technology that was developed by the Redstone arsenal that von Braun led, and so so his involvement was an important aspect of that. Now, is it likely that somebody could have taken over? Somebody could have been in there in his stead? Possibly, but it may not have looked exactly the same. I think that's one of the things we can explore when we get to the what if. What's also interesting is there are, as you mentioned before, Chris, there's parallel missile development here, and so it's not just the kind of the Redstone Jupiter kind of series. There's also the Atlas series that, to my knowledge, I don't think von Braun was involved with. And so the Atlas becomes eventually the SM-65 Atlas becomes what's known as the LV-3B Atlas, and this is the rest of the Mercury missions.
The Atlases were the Air Force project.
Atlases were the Air Force project, and so then you have the rest of these. You have Glenn, Carpenter, Shearer, and Cooper. That you have their missions through Project Mercury, and these occurred from 1962 to 1963. So we proven with this that von Braun is not completely indispensable to the effort. He's important, but he's not indispensable to this effort. And then you also had the development of the Titan rocket technology for Project Gemini, which was the second phase to the ultimate Apollo project. And I think that's this is one of the things that I think is extremely interesting when we're thinking about how we went about doing our how we went about doing manned space missions. Originally we had the idea that it's kind of can we put a person into space? Can we bring them back? Can we test some of this technology? And that was really the point of Project Mercury. Whereas Project Gemini was sort of the middle tier. It's sort of linking between Mercury and Apollo, is basically, can humans survive in space for extended periods of time? Because we know it's going to take a while to get to the moon. Can two spacecraft dock in space? That's important. Can you do a spacewalk? Is there a possibility of doing extravehicular activity? Can you get out of the spacecraft and do tasks there? Because that's going to be very important. And then can you still work on things like atmospheric reentry in as a context of this? And fortunately, the answer to all of these turned out to be yes, we can do all of those. But I think that made Project Gemini a really important set of missions that showed that we could do exactly those things, and led towards the possibility of a Project Apollo.
Okay. And just for I feel uniquely positioned because I'm coming from a bit of a non engineering or technical background. The Mercuries you mentioned were single man missions. These were one person we're putting up. And Gemini, for astrology people, I don't know if you're out there. I'll go ahead and throw that.
Yeah.
Twin. Two people.
These
were yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And a lot of the these are names that a lot of people will recognize if you're enthusiasts. I mean, these are including several astronauts that were on Apollo missions. I mean, everybody's heard of Neil Armstrong, everybody's heard of Jim Lovell, Buzz Aldrin. These are people that anybody who has any kind of passing knowledge of the U.S. space program, these are names that you will recognize that were the astronauts as a part of Project Gemini.
So after Gemini comes Apollo, which was not just Apollo, because Apollo 11 makes it. Apollo 1 actually had a huge accident, a big issue with it, that one of the things they tried to do was have an oxygen enriched atmosphere.
Right.
Because and what happened is the electronics created a spark and they lost the entire crew in a training accident. So there were other I'm not familiar enough with Apollo 2 through 10, but these were using the very similar I would call it class of spacecraft.
Yeah.
3 people that are basically getting to the moon, just not landing on it. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, they kind of go they make basically kind of baby steps here. And so really, so there were 3 kind of Apollo test missions that were tests of different rocket systems. And so this was Saturn 1B, and some of these were suborbital or were just ways that we would observe the technology in motion. So it could be argued that what was actually called Apollo 1 was actually Apollo 3.5, because the mission that was right after Apollo 1 was actually Apollo 4. So you had and that was a first test flight of the Saturn V rocket. Again, we're coming back full circle to von Braun, because von Braun was heavily involved in the development of the Saturn V rocket. Again, you could argue, could there have been a replacement technology if he was not around to do that? And there possibly could be, but Apollo 4 tested that, but there was no crew on Apollo 4, 5, or 6. The first Apollo mission that was crewed with this was Apollo 7, which did not use the Saturn V. That was another Saturn 1B mission, and so that was an orbital demonstration. Apollo 8 was the first crewed flight, the Saturn V, and it was the flyby of the moon. So they basically went to the moon, made, I don't know, some orbits over a certain period of time, and then they came home. And so that was Apollo 8. And then they kept testing. So Apollo 9 and demonstrated kind of what things might look like for a landing on the lunar surface. The Apollo 10 was kind of it was a dress rehearsal. They actually piloted, and this is my recollection. So if there's any mistakes, the audiences should feel free to point this out. But they actually did kind of do a dress rehearsal with the lunar module, and so and I don't know how far it was from the lunar surface, but they did that. They did that test flight, and then Apollo 11 was that first crewed landing. And then obviously we know Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 did land on the moon, and then Apollo 13 was the one, of course, that everybody knows very well, that did not land on the moon because of an accident, but all the astronauts were safely recovered.
and I do feel a little amiss for not for that we're talking about Apollo 13, we're talking about Houston, we have a problem, and we don't have Don on the show. That bothers me a little bit.
It's true. It's true that we definitely could benefit from having a Houstonian on the podcast today. There's no question there. So that was kind of the way the Apollo missions worked, and it was really the reason why the technology that I guess I should say the advance between Saturn 1B and Saturn 5 was so important is that Saturn 5 was really a heavy lift rocket, and so you really needed that to even have enough propellant and enough power to get you to the moon. You know, the medium lift rockets that we'd used before that just weren't quite up to the challenge. And you can, if you look, and I would encourage anybody to look at the relative illustrations of the Saturn 1B versus the Saturn 5. And there's just, I mean, you get a real sense for how absolutely massive a Saturn 5 rocket is. I mean, it's truly incredible. And so those are just the things that we think about when we have that Apollo mission that is really going to the moon, how we really need that big heavy lift rocket. The other thing that I think kind of probably bears a little discussion is what happened after the Apollo missions. What happened after we were successful in Apollo 11 and then 12 and then 14 through 17? What was the sentiment of the nation and the sentiment of the Congress for manned space travel?
Not a whole lot. I feel like one of the things is there wasn't the goal anymore. There wasn't
Right.
the and now everybody talks about Mars,
Mhm.
or building tourism is now literally happening right now, but there wasn't an achievable goal.
Yeah, no, I exactly agree with that. I think kind of the NASA sort of in many ways outkicked their coverage a little bit. They used a lot of their political clout, their political capital to try to get to the moon, and they were very successful in that. But by the time the program had wrapped up, and originally there was going to be through Apollo 20. They originally had the funding and the material to go through Apollo 20, and they ended up scrapping the rest of the missions. And at that point, there was a decision to go a totally different direction. You know, the idea of doing something that would succeed the Apollo, that would push the envelope further, was really scrapped in favor of what we now know as the space shuttle. And the space shuttle it definitely had its uses, but in many ways, it could be argued that the space shuttle, although reusable, was a step back from what we'd already achieved in the Apollo missions going to the moon. And so, yeah, we'd kind of run out of steam on the idea of pushing the envelope for manned space travel, and Congress didn't really want to fund it, and President Nixon didn't really necessarily want to fight for it either, even though his vice president at the time in 1972, Spiro Agnew, was actually very pro space travel, but Spiro Agnew had his own issues and had to resign, and then Nixon had his own issues and had to resign. So this really, a lot of this took the wind out of the sails of the program. And then at the same time, Nixon was working with his counterparts in China and Russia, China and the Soviet Union, on détente.
Mm-hmm. And that also brings up a really interesting thing about one of the big outward expressions of détente is all of the START and SALT talks.
Yeah.
Which bring us back to that constant thing we're talking about, that darker side of this project of using it to kill each other.
Right. And so if there's détente, if we're not as interested in killing each other, then there's less of a reason to develop some of the underlying technology. And so that it probably does directly result in some of the differences in the way that we decided to go about space travel, and why we decided to go the space shuttle route, and why we are in the situation that we find ourselves in now, where we really, are the kind of manned space program is really sort of out for hire here in the U.S. at this point, which is an unusual place to find ourselves. And so it makes you wonder, kind of in the what if, and we can kind of pivot that way to the what if you like, Chris. Are there scenarios where the absence of von Braun could have been either negatively impacting the space program, or potentially even positively impacting? Because I think that there's a case to be made for either of these, even though I think we kind of innately will kind of come at this from the idea that it would potentially impede things, at least initially. So one of the things that I always thought was interesting, Chris, is that President Kennedy gets a lot of credit for the Apollo project and for landing men on the moon, and I think we had talked yesterday on the other podcast about how Kennedy, there's a lot of things that are about him that are really overrated. This is probably one of them. Is that initially, as a senator, and even in his very early in 1961 as president, he was not very supportive of the space program. Yeah, he was not very interested in it. He was not very supportive. He didn't necessarily want to spend the money. But what he had appointed Johnson as the kind of the liaison to the, I guess it was a kind of a space advisory council, as I recall, Chris, and said, figure this out, basically. Well, and who does Johnson talk to learn more about what the potential of space travel could be? Wernher von Braun, who told Johnson to say, we need to invest in this. We need to invest in space travel. We need to invest in this new NASA agency if we're going to maintain leadership in space. And because he was a very von Braun, again, for all of his faults, he had a very clear vision of what he thought space travel should be. And he looked at it as from the standpoint of going to the moon. He looked at the standpoint of having permanent space stations, potentially a lunar base, going beyond the moon, even to things like Mars. And so that vision that was shared with Johnson and then ultimately to Kennedy probably did influence Kennedy's decision to really back this as a strategic program.
And the one thing that comes to mind now is, even earlier, von Braun's idea had always been he wanted to go to the moon. Mm-hmm. And he is just looking for somebody to sign checks for him. And part of me says it's almost more of an indictment of who he is, that's what he wants to do, and he will make a deal with whoever he can or has to, completely ignoring anything else about who's going to make that happen for him.
Yeah, that's true. There definitely was this was the mission. The mission was getting to the moon. The mission was making the rockets that would make that possible. And whether it's the German Reich or whether it's the U.S. government, he was willing to work with them. Again, problematic, but yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting kind of window into his psyche. So if we're looking at this from the what if, I think we've talked a lot about the what did. It's clear that von Braun had a lot of involvement with the Redstone, with the Jupiter, the Saturn V programs. If he weren't there, those programs probably would have looked quite a bit different. I think we can say that. But where does this really leave us as far as what the end result of that is? And so I kind of came up with three little scenarios for how this might look. One is what we'll call kind of maximally disruptive. This kind of encompasses, we'll call this sort of the great man idea of history. I generally don't subscribe to this, because I think history is more than just, just one person, and not even accounting for the fact that the idea of the Great Band completely discounts 51% of the population, which we definitely should not do. But the idea that this is that just one person can have this huge overarching impact on this is probably too much. But if we really want to take that to its potential, you could argue to say, well, maybe his absence really would cripple the U.S. space program. Maybe there wouldn't have been the ability. Maybe Redstone doesn't occur, and so there really isn't a good rocket at the time for the nascent Mercury program. And then that would again preclude the success of the Apollo program. Both because he was key to the development of the rocketry. Again, Redstone plus Saturn V. But then also because he was a very vocal advocate in his interest in manned missions, and maybe there wouldn't have been somebody that would perfectly fit into that niche for the moon missions and beyond. That's a possibility. I think that's probably unlikely. There's another kind of a minimal disruption to say that, yeah, the U.S. was behind Germany and the Soviets in rocket and missile technology, but there were still quite a few good engineers here. We still had other German engineers that we brought over, and that wasn't just von Braun. It was still a lot of people, and so it was really very likely that other people would have filled the role that von Braun filled, and maybe there really isn't much disruption there. Let's just assume for a second that there still isn't a Saturn V, for example. Let's say that he's so crucial to the effort of the Saturn V project that his absence totally kills that project. Well, okay, that's fine. There actually were some other thoughts about how Apollo might occur without the idea of a Saturn V, and this included even the kind of the extension of the Gemini technology. So again, Gemini was based on Titan II. There's a Titan III, and so you could certainly do something like a Titan 3C rocket, and that probably could give you translunar and so it would just be an extension of the Gemini program. Interestingly enough, I wonder not only whether that would have been possible, I wonder if using sort of making Apollo more sort of a Gemini plus, I wonder if that actually could have happened quicker. Because keep in mind, you had Gemini that was occurring. The Gemini 12 happened in 1966, and so you had a lot of time. So could it have been more like 2 years instead of 3? Would we have landed somebody on the moon in 1968 instead of 1969? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that remains a possibility. And the other thing that I would say is von Braun was known to be super conservative. He was very conservative. He built in a lot of extra safety features, redundancies, and things like that added a lot of weight on and added a lot of complexity on. Not everybody loved that about him.
Very, if you know anything about German engineering, they try and over-engineer everything. The one thing I'm reminded of is, and this is probably apocryphal. I do not know how much truth there is behind this, but that the United States spent thousands of dollars developing a pen that could write in zero gravity.
Yeah,
because normally ink, if you're holding your pen normally, the gravity is pulling it out. Well, you can't write in zero gravity. So the United States spent time and money developing pens, ink that can work in zero gravity. The Russians use pencils.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just has to do with the difference in the way that everybody thinks about thinks about the technology. The Russians are not necessarily looking to spend a ton of money, a ton of resources on things that they don't have to. It's just different in the way those things look, isn't it? Which I always think is very.
The one other thing I find interesting is, and this may be a little bit of a hole in my personal knowledge, but you do have, once you really have Gemini picking up, the Soviets fall off a lot in their competition. Is that fair to say that they don't see as much from them?
They do. Well, and they had their own accident that happened about the same time as Apollo 1. And their lunar program, I don't feel like necessarily completely recovered from that, and so that so they didn't make it. And so there was some of this that was PR too, that was like, are we really so far behind, or maybe we're not so far behind? So
Getting back to that other, what we were talking about earlier of using another country working on something as a little, hey, we need to beat them here, even though that country may not actually be doing a whole lot.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And so I just it's interesting how that the influence of the politics and the impression that may not be necessarily the truth, but the impression of what a program or what a country is likely to look like in terms of their reach for their space program, that I think can sometimes really influence things.
The other thing that just crossed my mind is a little thing happened in the Soviet Union in 1965. Um, the leader on their side that had been pushing a lot of that cutting edge, a lot of that development, a lot of that, in a certain way, dynamism got removed. Khrushchev was overthrown by the military, and they replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who's
Mhm.
very, who's a, whenever you look at him, he takes over as an elderly man. You just can't escape this image of jowls and standing on top of the concrete podium during Red Square, and it's really a stagnant period. So I think that also, that he's more thinking about, listen, let's spend our money on actual defense, let's try and spend some consumer goods, but let's not, and whenever you hear about one of the reasons that people turned on Khrushchev is because Cuba, that's a big
Yeah,
part of it. Cuban
that's a
Missile
big part.
Crisis, which we
Absolutely.
need to get back to, because all this technology, by the way, you're talking about Jupiters, that plays into this. But also just, so you do have a little bit of a retreat from that adventurism, and that doesn't leave the American space program. And I think that's part of one of the reasons you did see a drop off.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It got expensive. It got expensive, and we had bigger things to spend money on. And even though the 70s here were better than they were in the Soviet Union, the 70s were not easy here. You had oil crisis, you had stagflation. It was not a great time in the U.S. And I think even at the later part of the decade, you had Jimmy Carter's talk about our national malaise. So I mean, this was not a time necessarily that embodied quite the optimism of the 50s and 60s. I think there was this idea, and again, you and I weren't there, Chris. but there was clearly this idea in the 1950s and 1960s about that, we're the United States, we can do anything we put our minds to.
Also, and this is another side story that I have to say, I was actually just telling somebody at my office a couple of days ago this story, that though these two technologies are super exciting to everybody in the world, even if you are not actually involved in it yourself. These technologies of space, think about the Jetsons, and that plays a part in it. And these two, rockets and nuclear technology. The story I'm getting at is the history of swimsuits.
The history of
Bikini.
swimsuits.
I promise this. I promise this comes back to it.
Okay.
Because I was telling this person the story of Las Vegas, where they used to advertise nuclear testing at the Nevada test site, so that people that were there, on vacation could go up top and watch the mushroom clouds show up out of the desert. And this idea that both of these, culturally, these things were so amazing and cutting edge. We were promised rocket cars by now, but
We were.
and the swimsuit thing is, do you know what a bikini is named after?
It was the Bikini Atoll, right?
And which was important because it was literally a hunk of rock in the middle of the South Pacific that we could blow up nuclear weapons on, and there weren't a whole lot of people around to notice.
Yeah.
But just culturally, a French fashion designer saw a news story about that and thought, you know what would make my thing the hottest thing in the world? To name it after that, because people are associating this word bikini with the latest and greatest thing. And those are the two things that are, we weren't there, but that sense of these are the latest. Oh my God, everything about them is so amazing and cool.
Too funny. I hadn't thought about it that way, Chris, but that's really interesting that we got so much of the culture of the time, so much of the popular culture of the time was really informed by all of these developments, both the political developments, the Cold War, technological developments, the space race itself. We were using Velcro and drinking Tang after a while because of what astronauts were doing.
Yeah.
And a lot of us internalized a lot of this. I when I was a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s, I went to space camp. It was a great experience.
So without a von Braun kind of giving us that aim of the moon, you kind of hinted at it a little bit, and I'm going to come back to the other side of rocketry development that I've touched on a couple of times, but I want to hear what you think about. What do you think the absence of a von Braun does to the Trans-Apollo space program? What happens after that?
Yeah, I think without a von Braun, I think that's tough. Well, I just think it's tough. I don't know that necessarily whether von Braun's there or not. I think it would have been very challenging with the set of circumstances that we had to have something that after Apollo that really pushes the envelope. And so I think you would have to have some different economic circumstances for us, thus that such that the U.S. felt like it could afford additional programs. I think you would require some more durable public sentiment that doing these projects is a worthwhile thing. So I think those are things that would certainly have to be present. You could certainly have a different agitator than von Braun. So let's just say it's 1961, 1962, and you have a different engineer with who was somewhat charismatic and could work with politicians. But instead of saying let's go to the moon and calling it a day, but saying let's get ourselves to Mars by 1995. And everybody says, okay, maybe that's interesting. Now again, doing a 10-year project was tough. Doing a 25-year project is really tough. These days, getting Congress to agree on anything is almost impossible. But let's just say that we have that sort of framework to say, it's not necessarily that we have to get to the moon before 1970. It's that we want to get to Mars by 1995. Well, that probably involves us getting to the moon by 1970. It probably involves us with a more kind of permanent either lunar-based space station or both, probably by the 1980s, to be able to make that work. And maybe then you would be able to do a Mars mission, if not in the late 90s, then in the early 2000s. And we are 2021 and we haven't gone yet, which I have to admit a certain disappointment about.
Okay. We've talked, I got some stuff I want to talk about on that other side, but do you have any other, thoughts about the peaceful exploration programs that could have been different?
Peaceful exploration programs? What exactly do you mean?
Well, for example, kind of the one thing we didn't really mention that much is after one of the ways that space exploration went after Apollo was the shuttle, but you started having Voyager and other unmanned exploration. Do you think that basically happens similarly?
Yeah, I think you probably see a lot of that. You might even see, depending on what happens, if there isn't somebody there like a von Braun to advocate for manned space programs, maybe you see more robotic missions, maybe you see more space probes. I think we all, at least I remember Star Trek: The Motion Picture. The antagonist in the is a heavily modified Voyager 6. Well, we never got there. But maybe we would be in a scenario where there were more unmanned missions, and you do have a Voyager 6, or you do have a larger set of space probes that are sent out.
So you did mention Redstone and the Jupiters, and that's where I'm going back to. Here's a really interesting thing that I'm thinking about, which was the United States was beginning to have a little bit of a technological edge when it came to ballistic missiles around the time we're talking about. Specifically, that we were able to develop them and put them in a NATO ally called Turkey.
Yeah.
If we don't have that development, that's something I thought about, because he did come over, and when you think about the unmanned, when you think about the exploration of space, you kind of get a little bit of a sense that we kind of slept for 12 years a little bit.
Right.
But he was developing those missiles. If we don't have those missiles to trade in 62,
what do we trade? Do we just go to war, which was a real possibility, if Kennedy doesn't feel like he's got any bargaining chips.
Yeah.
And that's, and a lot of the generals, that's what they wanted to have. They wanted to strike first in Cuba.
Yeah, and if you look at just those maps from that period, I think that actually, to a lot of Americans, is a better way to understand the missiles we're talking about at this point.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, mostly southeastern U.S. Yeah.
A lot of them, yeah, but some of them, I mean,
even further.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
The other thing, and we talked about it, one of the important things about détente, one of the activities of détente, I guess is the best way to put it, one of the tangible things you saw coming out of détente was the SALT talks, was the talks to limit the number of both offensive missiles and defensive systems to protect against them. If you don't have all of that work done on the destructive side of this technology,
right,
so that we are still basing on bomber technology,
right,
it's a lot easier to count missile silos than to count these things that are, by their very nature, designed to be moved around. So do you think the absence of a concrete something you can move forward on, do you think that affects the way détente plays out?
Yeah, it might. And instead of reductions in missile numbers, maybe we're talking about reductions in in number of bombers, or the number of submarines that are nuclear armed. Maybe the focus is a little bit different on how we go about limiting nuclear arms, and it's if we just don't have as many of them, or maybe we just, because we don't have that technology, we don't build as many nuclear weapons, because really in the number of nuclear weapons after a while was just ridiculous. I mean, absolutely ridiculous on both sides. I mean, destroy the Earth multiple times over, to the point of kind of, in my opinion, pointlessness. And we've decommissioned most of those, and we still have a lot of nuclear weapons.
But the one thing I find interesting about this technology is, Don mentioned it on the 1960 election episode, but I brought it out of retirement again. I have a Dr. Strangelove behind me. The War Room.
The War Room in Dr. Strangelove.
Yes,
yeah.
These are
absolutely.
bombers.
Yeah.
These are bombers.
These are bombers.
If you look at that early 60s, it was still bombers. Bombers you can shoot down.
Yeah.
And that you have realistic defenses against them. There are not realistic defenses against these nuclear weapons. So a little bit kind of what you were saying earlier with we probably just invade Cuba. Maybe these weapons caused them to think twice about other things, about certain actions, because you don't have an effective defense against them.
That's possible. That's
And-
absolutely possible.
And the search for that defense brings us to the last thing, which I had in the back of my mind, and we talked about this when we discussed this a little bit earlier.
Yeah. Something I think you wanted to mention that comes a bit later.
Yes. So we've, all this space stuff, in any book or anything I'm listening to, I find it very important to center your mind around chronology.
Mm-hmm.
We've moved from the 60s of the race, where it really is a race. Mid 60s, there's that change we talked about in the Soviet political system, so that by the time that person, Brezhnev, his age is taking its toll on him in 83, 84, their program has stagnated. And that was I do agree. I think that was a conscious decision on their part to say, we're going to stop spending money on space.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to spend our money on not some on our people, just enough on our people to keep them happy, keep them not happy, but
Pacified,
not riotous,
not rioting, and to spend money on what we would consider to be much more conventional.
And while Daytona is happening, they're also sticking it to us in the third world.
Uh-huh.
That's a really interesting interplay there of the United States and the Soviet Union are talking to each other, and we're disarming this on these machines that can wipe cities off, but we are still engaged in selling as many small arms to as many different people throughout the world as we can. Into the 1980s, now we had something called Star Wars, which was an attempt to build a defense against incoming ballistic missiles.
And Star Wars was its nickname. So it was the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, as I recall.
Right. It was the Strategic Defense Initiative, trying to use space-based technologies, either kinetic interceptors or lasers, or I don't even think it ever really got to the engineering perspective of what we're actually going to do with it, other than some nice graphics to show people.
It seemed like mostly some neat things to put on the evening news. I absolutely recall seeing some on the CBS evening news when I was a kid, seeing some mock-ups, what we would consider very crude, but at the time they were very cutting edge, computer generated graphics about how it could intercept a missile. Now, again, it never did. I mean, none of this ever really happened, but the Soviet Union didn't necessarily know that. And they had kind of been laboring with, as you mentioned, an aging Brezhnev who was then succeeded by, two old sick men in Chernenko and Andropov. And then eventually you had you finally in 1985 had a more effective leader in Gorbachev, but for a country in which a lot of the damage had probably already been done.
And also two things, just I always try and bring the humor and bring the relatable stories. George H.W. Bush at this point is the vice president and was sent as the U.S. representative to attend the state funeral in the Soviet Union of, I want to say, Chernenko. Brezhnev, Chernenko, Andropov, these are all the people who, there really is a generation there.
Mm-hmm.
These people survived Stalin, they survived the Second World War, and there's this grouping of them, a little similar to what we were talking about on the earlier episode about these are the people who basically are the Kennedy-Nixon generation in the United States that shift to maybe the pre-baby boom, the greatest generation. These are those people in a leadership capacity.
Well, that's true, but keep in mind that Gorbachev took power in 1985, but on the U.S. we inaugurated a baby boomer president only 8 years later in 1993 with Bill Clinton.
Well, Gorbachev was north of 50, right?
Well, he was, and I'm not saying he was
Yeah.
he was definitely not a baby
Right.
boomer, but the point is that those kind of generational changes, even though they may have been very different generations, they still happened in pretty quick succession in both countries.
Yeah. And H.W. Bush is attending as the U.S. representative of, I believe it was at Chernenko's funeral, and he looks to somebody and he says, "I'll see you here this time next year."
Mhm.
And lo and behold, because at this point they had already selected on drop off, lo and behold, and drop dead inside of a year as well.
Yeah, two sick old men and not very effective. So,
but the other thing, Gorbachev, I think honestly did try and put some money to butter. He really wanted to reform the Soviet system to try and deliver even more to his people.
yeah,
And the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was just was one thing that the United States was able to wave in front of the hardliners, in front of the old Soviet military, to say, "Hey, listen, we're about to invalidate all of your offensive capacity to us."
right.
The thing that that is a little misunderstood when you think about this is, if that happens, like you were talking about when it comes to Cuba, there's nothing to stop the United States. If you cannot destroy the United States, but they can destroy you, there's nothing to stop them from doing it. And
no, that's right. And it was really the ballistic missiles that were the leveling factor there. No, that I mean, it makes total sense that this kind of changed the game to some degree,
or could have
changed the game to some degree.
Because these people came of age in World War II. They had been the lower level people when the Soviet Union was almost destroyed by conventional means.
Yeah.
You can't forget that fear in them.
Well,
I
think that that kind of brings it full circle from the fear of the Soviet Union in the start of the Cold War in 1945 to the fear that the Soviet Union had as they were starting to collapse in the late 1980s. So I think that kind of brings it full circle for us, Chris. I think that's a good wrap on this discussion.
I think so. And I think it is. I think it really, that's a really interesting exploration of, you do have people that look at it and say, all right, listen, as nice as Tang is it really worth millions of dollars on space exploration? But I think, we've been able to talk about some interesting, more hard power byproducts of it. So do you have any comments you'd like to close with?
No, I think that it's a helpful exploration to understand that in a complex set of projects like the U.S. space program, one person can certainly have an effect, but that even a really important person is unlikely to totally derail the effort. So it kind of fights against the kind of the great person concept of history that a lot of times was taught in the past, not so much anymore. So I think that's a good exploration of this, and maybe a good wrap up of the Kennedy related discussions that you've been doing, Chris, or do we still have more of those?
Oh, we've got more coming.
Okay.
We've got more coming.
Those are ones you're probably doing with Don or other hosts.
Yeah, I've actually there has to be one on Vietnam.
Yep.
There has to be one on that. And I'm working through some other ideas about, I want to finish out the month. For those of you, it should have dropped already, the 1960 election episode. The holidays are coming. And people travel, and I, for one, like to download podcasts and load them up while I travel. So
I agree. So that I think that's a good plug, a good plug for A Fork in Time, a good plug for Room Where It Happened. And so we've got some exciting podcasts coming up. Chris and I were recording today. We recorded yesterday, and Chris is going to be recording some additional episodes, it sounds like. And so I think you will have plenty to keep yourself entertained while you're on your holiday travels.
Yeah. So I do want to, in closing, wish everyone a happy and safe and effective holiday travels. I hope you don't hit traffic. I hope you don't hit anything. Have a wonderful time. And thank everyone for listening to our podcast.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/A Fork in Time, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/A Fork in Time. We hope you will join us next time.